Hey Bio30s, and welcome to our discussion today about embryonic development. As you might remember from my video 2 videos ago, I referred to the fact that prenatal development is divided into two main categories, two main divisions. You've got embryonic development in a human that occurs from between weeks 1 to 8, and then you've got fetal development, which occurs between weeks 9 to 39. We're going to spend today's video discussing those first very crucial 8 weeks in human development before the embryo then becomes a fetus. My next video, my last, actually second last video for the unit, will be discussing weeks 9 to 39, which will be the development of the fetus. But embryonic development, in the short period of time that it occurs, a lot is happening, and in fact, the government's going to concentrate more on this section of development than it will on the fetal development, just because so much is happening on a day-to-day, a week-to-week basis in the embryonic development phase. When we get to fetal development, it's more about refinement of the body systems, but pretty much all your major body systems are basically laying down foundations during the first 8 weeks, and that's why this is such a crucial stage. Well, when we left off a couple of videos back when I discussed fertilization, we had discussed basically the male and the female gamete, the sperm and the egg coming together to form that one single-celled zygote. That was sort of conception. Now we're going to get into what happens to that actual zygote over the course of the next several weeks as it develops into an embryo and eventually then becoming a fetus at week 9. So basically, as soon as that zygote forms, stuff gets happening fairly quickly. There is a bit of a rest period after fertilization. There's about a 30-hour window where no divisions occur. But after about 30 hours, the first cell division will happen. You'll wind up with a 2-celled embryo at that point. And cell division will continue to occur as that zygote slowly moves its way down through the oviduct toward the uterus. And what you'll notice is, in this diagram here, there's a lot going on, and it'll be kind of covered over several pages in the notes, but those initial divisions, what happens is that initial zygote that's a cell this size will divide into 2 cells that are half the size of the original zygote. So what happens in the initial series of mitotic divisions, which are known as cleavage divisions, these cleavage divisions basically make each of the cells smaller. So the actual embryo itself doesn't get any bigger for about the first, 3 or 4 days. At that point, then something occurs where the actual embryo basically kind of cracks out of its shell, as it were, and then begins to grow. But the first initial divisions will lead to, by about day 3, you will get a morula. And a morula is, if I can find here's my felt right here. A morula is actually a 16-cell embryo. So by the time we get to day 3, we've got a 16-cell embryo known as a morula, which is Latin for mulberry, because it looks like a berry, probably a very aptly named description of this embryo. And that is the first sort of name that you should be familiar with after the zygote. Day 3, you get to what's called a morula stage. After day 3, some really big stuff begins to happen. A process known as blastulation occurs between day 3 and about day 4 and 5, where what happens is this embryo that's inside the outer, and remember the outer shell is still there. Remember the initial zygote had that the corona radia and the zona pellucida around it. And those shells are still intact around the developing embryo. But what happens during blastulation is the embryo basically oozes its way out of that shell casing so that it can actually begin to grow more. And then what will happen is some cells will begin to divide around the embryo, which are not necessarily the embryo itself. It'll be sort of the supporting structure that will help the embryo in its development over the course of the next just under 9 months. At this point, after blastulation, you get an embryo known as a blastocyst or a blastula, and that occurs by about day 4 or 5. And it's interesting to note, and again, here's a slide here discussing sort of the the first week or so of the embryo, and we're just at that stage because the blastula, which forms on day 4 or 5, and I'll get to what makes up the blastula in a second. By about day 7, after anywhere between day 5 to day 7, after the fertilization event occurs, so about a week after ovulation, that's when that blastula is going to implant somewhere in the uterus. It takes about a week from when it becomes the zygote to basically work its way down through the oviduct into the uterus and to find a suitable place to basically take up residence. And then it basically burrows itself into the endometrium, where it then continues its development. Now, the blastula itself is comprised of 3 things that you should be familiar with. The inner group of cells, the black cells you see in my diagram there, that's referred to as the inner cell mass. That's the actual embryo. Around it, you're going to have a series of cells known as the trophoblast, and I'll get to that in a second. And then you've got a hollow cavity that separates it's sort of like a hollow ball at this point, with a little mass of cells on the one side of the ball. The inside hollow space inside the ball is known as the blastocele. Now, the trophoblast has some pretty important things that we should be familiar with. The trophoblast is eventually going to become a extra embryonic layer known as the chorion, and the chorion will eventually become the placenta. So this red structure here, essentially, you're looking at essentially on the first 5 days of development, you're beginning to see the beginnings of the placenta at that point. The trophoblast as well produces a hormone, and I talked about this at the end of the female reproductive system lesson. I said that, remember we talked about how at the end of in the second half of the ovarian cycle, the corpus luteum forms inside the ovary, and it produces large amounts of estrogen and progesterone, which maintains the endometrial lining. After about day 23, if there's no fertilization event that occurs, the corpus luteum begins to degenerate, and that will eventually drop the levels of progesterone and estrogen, which will cause the female to menstruate. Well, we've got a live one down there in the uterus right now. We have to prevent a menstruation event, which is now only about a week away. When it implants, it's on day 21. Menstruation will occur at about day 28 to day 1 of the next cycle. So there's got to be something that's going to prevent the uterus from shedding its endometrial lining. That's going to be produced by a hormone in the trophoblast known as HCG. It's produced by the embryo, and it's basically going to tell the female, and by the way, HCG stands for human chorionic gonadotropin is what it stands for, but HCG is fine. It's a hormone that basically targets the corpus luteum and tells the corpus luteum to not shrink. So it basically targets the ovary, says, hey, there's a corpus luteum in here, don't shrink it down. As a result, it's going to continue to produce high levels of estrogen, continue to produce high levels of progesterone, which is going to prevent the endometrial lining from actually being shed. This is going to prevent menstruation from occurring. And by the way, if you take a pregnancy test, this is the hormone the pregnancy test is looking for, because there's no way HCG should be inside of your, if you're a female, there should be no way that there's HCG in you unless you've got an embryo. It's the only hormone that's produced by another living organism inside of your own body that actually controls your body function. So HCG can only be inside of your body if you've got a developing embryo inside the body. I need to just get back here to a previous slide. I have jumped ahead. Hold on. Let me go back. Fingers kind of triggered that slide a little early. Come on. There we go. Okay. So that's what the trophoblast does. It becomes eventually the placenta, but initially its big role is to produce HCG, which is the embryo basically telling the female not to menstruate so that it doesn't actually get flushed out through a menstruation event. So that's what the trophoblast does. The inner cell mass is comprised of stem cells. And you may have heard of stem cells. If you're interested in stem cells, watch this video. There's a lot of controversy. I talked about stem cells in the molecular genetics unit and how they can be used to you can basically rebuild cells in a body. You can basically say, hey, I've got damage to my nervous spinal cord. Can I regrow spinal neurons? Because stem cells really can become any other cell. If you program them the right way, a stem cell can become any other cell in the body. And one of the ways you can harvest stem cells is through embryonic stem cell, harvesting. Which, of course, if you did that, this is where you would harvest these stem cells from. It would be from a blastula that you would remove them from, and by removing the stem cells, you essentially would kill the embryo. But these stem cells are at the heart of a big controversial branch of science that has a lot of promise. So again, watch that video that I just indicated if you're interested to see what the whole deal is with stem cells, and what the benefits, and also what some of the ethical dilemmas are by using stem cells that are embryonic in nature. Anyways, these cells are pluripotent, which means they can become anything they want to be when they grow up. Eventually, they are going to undergo some differentiation here in a couple of minutes here. I'll get to that in a second, but eventually they begin to realize what they want to be when they grow up, and they will begin to form different groups of cells inside the embryo, which will lead to different groupings of organs. Some of them might develop into nervous tissue, some might develop into skin cells, and I'll get to that here in a couple of seconds. So after the first week, we've got a zygote that undergoes cleavage divisions to become a morula after day 3, 16-cell mulberry-shaped embryo. It breaks out of its outer shell, out of that zona pellucida and the corona radia, and it undergoes a process called blastulation, which basically begins to divide it into other cells, extra embryonic cells, as well as the embryo. The embryo is now known as an inner cell mass. It's cased within a cell, a ball of cells known as a trophoblast, which is going to release a hormone called HCG, which is going to prevent the female from menstruating, and it's also going to eventually become the placenta of the that will be the connection point between the embryo and the mother. Okay. At this point, we enter into the second week of embryonic development, and that section of development is known as gastrulation. Gastrulation is a process by which the cells in the embryo begin to realize what they want to do. And you get a process where the stem cells that were initially in the blastula undergo a process called morphogenesis, otherwise known as differentiation. They begin to classify themselves into groupings. The cells, after 2 weeks, will divide into 3 main groups, and these are the embryonic cells. So the blue, the black, and the green layers here now represent the embryo. The red cells still represent what was originally the trophoblast, which is now the chorion, and there is now 2 spaces on either side of the embryo that are going to form other extra embryonic layers, which I'll get to in a couple seconds. But the one side essentially becomes the yolk sac and what's called the allantois. The other side becomes the amnion. I'll get to that in a second. The important thing you want to remember about gastrulation is this. You've got the stem cells that now break into 3 clusters of cells known as the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. Each of these layers is going to be responsible for the development of certain body systems. For example, the ectoderm, which is labeled here in green, it's going to become things like the nervous system, hair, skin, sweat glands, and teeth. And should you be familiar with what the ectoderm becomes? Yes, you should. Like if I were to tell you, hey, the nervous system arises from which of the 3 germ layers of the gastrula, you should be able to tell me that, well, it's the ectoderm. I should know that. The mesoderm, which is in this case the black layer, it's going to give rise to muscles, connective tissue, the kidneys, the gonads, and the circulatory system. And the endoderm, which is the blue layer, it's the innermost layer of the organism, and it'll eventually become the innermost layer of the organism. It's going to become the GI tract, the respiratory system, the liver, the pancreas, and the endocrine glands. So, and again, all that information I just provided with you is on that slide there. There's a whole listing of all the different body systems that arise from each of those 3 germ layers that form inside the gastrula, and that's at essentially now week 2. These primary germ layers are basically going to give rise to every single body system that will eventually form after this. Great little diagram here, which basically goes through the morula, the blastula, all the way up to the gastrula there, showing you sort of the processes that are involved in essentially the first 2 weeks of embryonic development. At this point, I'd like you to just maybe take a quick watch of this video. This is going to be a video that describes the development of early embryos in all sorts of animals, but it's going to be pertinent to what we've been discussing here with the morula and the blastula and the gastrula. Give that video a watch just to kind of see some of the animations and how the early embryo develops in animals. The last thing I want to discuss about early embryonic development before we just discuss weeks 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, which are sort of more refinement of the embryo at that point. The last stage, when we get to the 3rd week of development, we have a last process. So we've had blastulation essentially between the first few days and the end of week 1. We had blastulation. We then have gastrulation between weeks 1 and 2. Between weeks 2 and 3, we have a process called neurulation, which is essentially the formation of the spinal cord and the brain. You can see it in the diagram here. What you're looking at is the back of the organism. You can see the spinal cord beginning to develop along the back there in the middle. And right here at the top, you can see what looks like a little Pac-Man mouth. That is actually the top of the head that's still open, and it's sort of the skin and the bone beginning to wrap in around the actual brain that's forming in the top of, well, not bone yet, but that would be sort of the hemispheres of the brain coming in together on the top of the head. So this is, in week 3 is when the brain forms and the central nervous system, all of that stuff forms essentially during week 3 in a process called neurulation, where we develop what's called a notochord or a neural tube that forms in week 3. Okay. Apparently my thing is frozen. There we go. Another diagram here to show you sort of the overall look of what's happening during neurulation and gastrulation and neurulation. You wouldn't be asked specifically, but it kind of shows you the development of each of the germ layers, the mesoderm, the endoderm, the ectoderm, what's happening there, and how the actual neural tube, the notochord, the spinal cord, essentially, how it's developing. Okay, so all of this time right now, the embryo is developing, but at the same time, as I've mentioned, there are some extra embryonic layers forming as well. We talked about the trophoblast. The trophoblast is that layer of cells that surrounded the blastula, and then it becomes the chorion in the gastrula. And I also mentioned that there was something called the yolk sac, the allantois, and the amnion. These are the 4 extra embryonic layers. So the chorion, as I mentioned earlier, it originally was the trophoblast. It becomes essentially the placenta, and I will get more to the placenta here in a couple of seconds. You then have the amnion, which is to me the easiest one of the bunch to name, because the amnion sounds like amniotic fluid or amniotic sac, which is the protective layer around the embryo as it develops. I mean, when a female is about to give birth, her water breaks. That's the amniotic fluid that's being released when a female's water breaks just before birth. Then you've got the allantois and the yolk sac. The allantois essentially becomes most of the umbilical cord, which is what attaches the embryo to the placenta, and that's how it exchanges materials to and from its body. Waste can leave through the umbilical cord. Nutrients can come in via the umbilical cord. So basically, the mother is basically transferring nutrients to the embryo, and the embryo is transferring waste products to the mother to get rid of on its behalf. And then you've also got the yolk sac, which is one of the most primitive parts of the early embryo. It harkens back to when you think of a yolk, you think of like a chicken, you think of an egg with a yolk in it. That's exactly what the yolk sac is. It's a remnant of an earlier evolutionary stage in our collective history as organisms. But that yolk sac disappears very quickly early in embryonic development, and it will become part of the umbilical cord as well. So essentially, you've got the chorion becoming the placenta, the amnion becomes the amniotic fluid and sac, the allantois and the yolk sac essentially together form the umbilical cord. Great diagram here, and I've seen this one on diploma exams before. It's a diagram that comes up quite often. Take a look at that diagram. I don't have a diagram on the board, but take a look at that in your notes. A really good diagram that shows you where all of them are. And you could see a diagram where you would have to identify where these extra embryonic layers actually do occur and where they occur. As well, the diagram, which I love too, also shows the endoderm, the ectoderm, and the mesoderm. It shows you the 3 germ layers that form during gastrulation, when the gastrula forms. And it's also telling you what each of those germ layers will eventually become later on in the development of the embryo and the fetus. So keep that in mind. A couple of other hallmarks here before we finish up our topic today. The heart begins beating at day 18. There's no blood yet, but it does start beating. It's one of the earliest organs that actually is actually functional in the embryo. So the heart starts beating very early on, day 18. Pretty much between gastrulation and neurulation is when the heart starts beating. Um, Great diagram here, which shows you the whole overview that I've talked about, everything from the zygote to all the way up to neurulation occurring there, and the formation of the extra embryonic layers. Great diagram there for you to look at. Okay, let's take a look at some of the things that happened during weeks 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Week 4, you got blood beginning to form. Limb buds begin to appear. You begin to see the limb buds on the embryo. There's evidence now of eyes, ears, and a nose on the head as it begins to form. Lungs and kidneys begin to form as well. Week 5. Oh, and by the way, at week 4 of the development, right now, the female would only be 2 weeks late on her menstruation. So 4 weeks into the development of the embryo, we would be essentially we would be on to day 14 of the next menstrual cycle, which would be the next ovulation, which means that the female would be 2 weeks late on her period at 4 weeks of development. So at that point, there would be a noticeable delay in hey, I'm not getting my periods, what's going on? But at that point, there's already been. You can see all the development that's occurred, and we're only now 2 weeks late on the menstruation event in the menstrual cycle for the female. Week 5, the heart begins to actually pump blood. There's enough blood now for the heart to begin actually pumping blood through the blood vessels. Eyes are now open, but there are no eyelids. Brain cells begin to differentiate. We're starting to see differences between the hindbrain, the forebrain, the midbrain, that kind of stuff. Week 6, we're dealing with the limbs are beginning to lengthen now. They're beginning to flex a little bit. And the gonads begin to start producing hormones, which are going to affect external genitalia as well at week 6. 7 and 8, again, the roller coaster continues. There's a lot, like I said, a lot of stuff going on. Internal organs have essentially formed after the end of the embryonic stage. Nervous system begins coordinating the body's activities. A skeleton begins to develop, but it's only made of cartilage. The bone skeleton will not form until early in the fetal developmental stage. Around week 9 is when the bones begin to replace the cartilage. And again, this is harkening back to an earlier stage of evolution, because the original vertebrates, the oldest branch of the vertebrate phylum, are the sharks and the rays and the skates, and they all have cartilage skeletons. So this cartilage skeleton harkens back to a much earlier evolutionary state, but again, it does get quickly replaced by bone just at the beginning of the fetal developmental stage. Eyes and eyelids are now well developed. Nostrils are developed. They've got plugs in them, though. There's like plugs of mucus in the nostrils, so they can't actually, suck in all the amniotic fluid that's around them. At the end of week 8, the yolk sac, as I mentioned, disappears very quickly. It disappears by the end of week 8. It shrinks it essentially shrinks. The amniotic sac begins to enlarge around it, and it basically connects the embryo to the mother via the placenta. Before I discuss more about the placenta and the umbilical cord, though, just kind of a side note here. As I mentioned, that the external genitalia begin to form by about week 6, but it is undifferentiated initially. More hormonal activity will have to basically come in. So if you take a look here, this is sort of the undifferentiated version of the gonads that will eventually either form into a female's gonad system or a reproductive system, or a male, depending on, again, the chromosomal sex of the baby. If the chromosome sex is an XY or an XX, you're going to either see the male for XY or XX for the female. However, in some cases, this does not happen. You may have heard of the term hermaphrodite. That is not the case in humans. There are no hermaphrodites because humans cannot have two sets of functioning sex gonads. There are some organisms that are hermaphrodites. There are some worms that actually have both ovaries and testes, so they can actually basically produce both sets of gametes to basically produce an offspring. But in hermaphrodites, we do not have any true hermaphrodites in the human species. Can there be pseudo-hermaphrodites? Yes, there can be. Because of chromosomal issues, there can be partially developed male or female gonads, but not two sets of fully functional gonads. And again, the problem with all of this arises again back with meiotic cell division. We talked about non-disjunction, where you can get an extra chromosome, or you're lacking a chromosome because of an uneven division of the genetic material during cell division. And that's exactly what can happen also with your sex chromosomes. Normally, you're either going to have an XX on the chart here or an XY configuration for a female or a male, but you can have an X configuration, just one X. That's known as Turner syndrome. Those individuals have defective ovaries. They're absent, they're sterile, no development of there's no pubic hair development, no menstrual cycle. They rarely attain adult height of more than 5 feet. You can also have an organism, a human that has 3X chromosomes. That would be known as triple X syndrome. Individuals have no sexual abnormalities and may have children, but have some of them, however, can have mental cognitive defects that can occur. So, and again, there's several different types of these disorders that are on the sheet here because of abnormal number of chromosomes. You can have XXX, or you can have XXXXX. You can have XXY. You can have XXXY, so 3 X's and a Y. You can have 4 X's and a Y. You can have an X with 2 Y's. So there's all these variations that can occur because of non-disjunction. If you're interested about the ramifications of this in the animal kingdom, a great little video here put together by Sideshow about, it's called Intersex in the Animal Kingdom. Give that one a watch. Very interesting about how certain organisms, because of certain issues, can have, it can be the fluidity of gender with different organisms again, and some of it has to do with chromosomal, some chromosomal issues that occur during meiosis and the formation of the gametes. Okay. Back to our final topic, which is the placenta and the umbilical cord. So the umbilical cord, the yolk sac shrinks, the amniotic sac enlarges about week 8. You get the formation of the umbilical cord by week 8. It's sort of connecting out of the belly button of the embryo to the mother's, the placenta, which is essentially a formation or a union of both the baby's tissues or the embryo's tissues and the mother's tissues, and you're forming this sort of a transfer area where blood vessels of the mother and the baby can come really close to one another. They don't touch each other, but you can get diffusion between the blood vessels of the mother that are in the placenta with the blood vessels of the baby, and then the baby can remove waste products through the umbilical cord, and it can get nutrients from the mother through the placenta back through the umbilical cord. The placenta also plays another major role, especially in the second and third trimester, which I'll get to when we discuss fetal development in the next video. It does take over the production of estrogen and progesterone. As it gets bigger, it will begin to produce the estrogen and progesterone that have been basically keeping the mother from menstruating up till now. Up till this point, it's the corpus luteum in the ovary that's producing enough estrogen and progesterone to keep the mother from menstruating, to basically abort the developing embryo. At about week 9 into the second, I would say more into the second trimester. So about anytime after about week 14, the placenta is now large enough to produce sufficient enough of estrogen and progesterone to basically stop the mother from menstruating. So at that point, the corpus luteum can finally degenerate inside the ovary, and the baby no longer has to produce, or the embryo doesn't have to produce anymore HCG to basically maintain the corpus luteum. So there is a transfer and responsibility of that level of estrogen and progesterone. And again, those levels have to remain very high throughout the pregnancy, because that's what basically keeps everything kind of in place down there until the mother is ready to deliver the baby at the end of 39 weeks. All right. And again, a great little diagram here of the placenta and the umbilical cord and how it works. The placenta, again, arises from two sources. It comes, like I mentioned, it comes from the chorion of the embryo, which I mentioned earlier today, and also the blood vessels of the mother's circulatory system. They sort of combine and merge to form this thing called the placenta. And the placenta is fully developed a little bit beyond the end of the embryonic phase. The placenta is pretty much fully formed week 10, which is 2 weeks into fetal developmental stage. But by the time we get to the end of the embryonic stage, the placenta is pretty much almost fully formed, but it does fully form by the end of week 10. And that, my friends, is the end of embryonic development. That was probably the longest section of notes for this half of the unit. There is a booklet that is not due until the end of parturition and lactation. So there's 2 more videos coming up after this one where you'll be kind of working on the same booklet. I don't need to see the booklet until all 3 of the sections are done. But for now, if you want to kind of keep on track, so you're not doing the whole entire booklet at the end of the 3 videos, for now I would recommend find the copy of the Prenatal Development question booklet, and based on today's discussion, you can answer questions 1 to 7. Next day, I'm going to be walking you through the weeks 9 to 39 in prenatal development, better known as the fetal developmental stage of prenatal development. So thanks for tuning in today there, and we will see you next time.